Funding for Current Conversations is provided by University of Oklahoma President's Office, University of Oklahoma Outreach, and World Literature Today. Welcome to this special edition of Current Conversations. I'm R.C. Davis Indiano. Our show today is a compilation of 5 of our favorite shows. We've asked each of our crew members to choose their favorite show, and you'll see segments from those 5 shows today. I'll be back to introduce each person's choice. Our show director and producer, Angela Nicholson, chose the first episode with Dr. Bob Suzuki. He talks about his experiences in Japanese internment camps during World War II and his lifelong support of civil rights in the United States. Enjoy this segment with Dr. Bob Suzuki.
Yeah, I think there was, and it really goes back to my childhood when World War II broke out and the attack on Pearl Harbor took place. Our family was interned in an internment camp in the desert of southern Idaho. I was just a child then, only 6 years old, but that experience stayed in my mind for a long, long time. And when I went to college at UC Berkeley as a freshman, I took a course in speech, and the instructor said, you all need to give a speech toward the end of the semester, and it could be about anything related to education. And for some reason, I decided I would do it on education in the internment camps. And so I went to the Bancroft Library, which is the main library on the Berkeley campus, which I later learned had the largest collection of materials on the internment of any library in the world. And so when I went there and started looking at references, I was overwhelmed with all the literature that was available. So I read through a good share of that, and the more I read, the greater I understood the huge injustice that had been done to Japanese Americans who had been interned.
How long was your family in a camp?
They were in there for 3.5 years.
That is a long time.
It was, especially for the conditions that we had to live under, because they put us into these tar paper barracks that were maybe 100 feet long, and they were divided into single rooms where a family was assigned to a single room that was maybe 20 by 20 feet in size. And so we had to live in that condition for the 3.5 years, and that's where I started school, actually. And when I started school, I didn't speak a word of English because my parents spoke nothing but Japanese, and we were in an isolated area in Central Oregon where my dad worked on a railroad. And so I had to learn English as I was going through 1st and 2nd grade, and I almost flunked both grades because of that. And by the time I got to the 3rd grade, I was finally speaking English and understanding English, so I did a lot better. But that experience stuck in my mind when I went to UC Berkeley and took that speech class. And I did all that research in the Bancroft Library. And the more I read about it, the angrier I got, because I realized what an injustice had been done to us. And so when I gave that speech to that class, which was taught by a graduate assistant with about 25, 30 students in it, it was an angry speech. It was a hard-hitting speech. I talked about the injustice that was done to us at the time, and at the end of my speech, the instructor, who was quite familiar with the event, asked the class, how many of you knew this happened? And one student raised his hand, and it was another Japanese American who had also been interned during the war. And this was in 1955, which was only about 5 years after the camps were closed. So it tells you something about the ignorance of the general public about events like this.
Even to the present day.
Even to this present day.
Our show editor, Ray Leva, chose the next episode with Dr. Nina Livesey. She is a noted biblical scholar who tries to bring together the world of scholarship and religious belief. Enjoy this segment with Dr. Nina Livesey.
The Christianity seminar, which is the current seminar, starts with what you said, the New Testament. And another way of talking about that is to say it's a canon. It's a book. So if I had a book, or if you had a book, you know that a book, because it's got a binding on it, creates an entity. Well, this
Kind of
entity,
authority. is the
an
book.
authority, an entity, and creates a thing. You might think of that thing as Christianity itself. So it makes for an easy way of talking about Christianity. In fact, people still today talk about it and hold the book up. It gives a unified view of Christianity, just the whole notion of this canon or book,
Yeah.
and that there's one thought to it, and even the whole idea that that book speaks for itself. It doesn't even need to be interpreted. Some people may consider it that way. So by beginning with canon, the Christianity seminar takes a point of a launching point, because it can study this phenomenon of a canon and basically deconstruct it.
Canon meaning what was put in the Bible and what was left out.
Or just the fact that it is an entity. And another way of thinking is an entity that always and already existed.
Mm-hmm.
So because you have the book, you think, oh, Christianity was always here, always this book, always looked like this. So that book becomes symbolic of what Christianity is. So it's a starting point for the seminar. That's why it's interesting to think in terms of the canon. By canon, a group of books together. That's
Could
what
I
mean
add
by
something that
Sure.
maybe de-exoticizes what may sound exotic to people a little bit about the Westar Seminar? Any seminarian who goes to seminary school and learns about the history of the Bible learns that that is not the case.
Right.
That it was a collection of 27 books. It was in the 4th century. They were not brought together as definitive. Later, when the church formed, it looked back and said it was definitive, took some things in, took some things out, etc. It's a messier story than people generally have to deal with.
That's exactly right. So as I said, always already there. It wasn't. What do you mean it wasn't always already there? That it took 4 centuries and committees, like, think Westar Jesus Seminar with the beads.
Yeah.
It took committees to decide what books were going to go in there, and 4 centuries. And as Hal Taussig does a nice job explaining, it's not until the 5th or 7th century that you actually get a codex or an actual book that you can say is the New Testament. So it's very messy.
A messy process.
And it's not univocal. So once you get into canon studies, here's the canon that you're working off of. But once you start to study it, it's inside it. You open the pages, it's very messy. It's not one voice. It's 27 different voices, and some of them conflict with each other.
And a lot of interesting questions come
Right.
up. Tell us something that you think is going to happen in religious studies over the next several years, in about 30 seconds, that you think will have an impact, it could influence a lot of people, and might catch people by surprise.
Well, one of the things for Christians that might catch them by surprise is how Jewish Christianity is. So that early Christians were really Jews. And that is, I think, in itself a little bit shocking, especially when you consider the history of anti-Judaism. You mean we're not Christians, we were Jews? This could be quite shocking, I think, but it's the truth. There is no Christianity until the 2nd century. In fact, some people say there's no Christianity maybe until you get that canon, until the 4th century. So what are we? What are these people? They're not Christians.
Our director of photography, Brian Bowden, chose the next segment with political scientist Mackenzie Israel Trummel. She gives us insights into the current contenders to be President of the United States? Enjoy this segment.
So, I mean, this is something that political scientists have been talking about for quite a while now. We call it political polarization, and that's a phrase that has worked its way into media and I think people's general understanding of politics. But one of the big drivers of political polarization in our governmental institutions is this primary process. So in order to appeal to your voters in the primary, who are not a random sample of general election voters, you have to be more extreme, and that happens on both sides, but it is more pronounced, you're right, on the Republican side. We saw this with McCain in 2008, right? He became this ultra-conservative candidate in the primary, and that had never been his political identity.
No.
And I think to some people it really rang false, and Democratic voters he might have peeled away in the general were now suddenly more wary of him because of the primary process.
Well, and Romney too, I remember him describing himself as severely conservative,
Yeah,
like
he
he
never
couldn't.
had been.
Exactly. So could you talk about race in this
Sure.
contest a little bit? It's come up a lot.
Yeah.
Donald Trump talking about keeping Muslims temporarily out of the U.S., and Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, even though they are Latinos themselves, taking very tough stands about the undocumented and so on. What role is that playing?
Well, so it's likely to play different roles for different voters. So if we think about white voters generally, it appears that there is a segment of white voters to whom that rhetoric is really appealing right now. Research suggests that rhetoric isn't necessarily a winning strategy, however. In the US, we have a strong norm at this point of equality. We believe that we treat people equally, that we should treat people equally, and we don't like it when things conflict with that norm. A lot of the policies, particularly coming from Trump, keeping an entire religious group out of the country, I mean, that's institutionalized religious discrimination, right? Most Americans, if you talk about, do you support religious discrimination, will say no, because that violates this norm. Previous research has suggested that in order for that norm to really be activated and people recognize these policies conflicting with their values, it requires that opposing candidates make that case clearly. And it seems that some Republicans have tried to do that, but it's not necessarily clearly coming across. Now, the other issue is that the research that's really looked at this has been focused on the relationship between whites and blacks, and how does racial rhetoric against African Americans change whites' voting preferences. Now, religion is a different beast, and we're also in a world where people are concerned about terrorism, which they equate with Muslims, at the highest levels in a decade. So it's not necessarily clear that what we would anticipate being the winning strategy for an opposing candidate to say, hey, this policy really conflicts with our norms and values as Americans, we shouldn't support it. It's not clear that that's going to work in this context to the same way.
So this could be a dangerous strategy that just Trump hasn't seen the outcome of it yet. But
yeah, that's possible. It's a dangerous strategy that could pay off for him, or it could really backfire depending on how well those who oppose him frame their response.
And let me go back about something you said, and I don't know how, what we know about these groups individually, so maybe you could fill this in. Would it be communities of racial minorities that would respond in a negative way to all this talk about race? Or are you saying also that conservative whites would draw the line there, and they kind of feel like they're going too far if they feel that people are being discriminated against, that sense of fairness that you talked about in America?
Yeah, I think it's both.
Okay.
Previous work has really suggested that this type of threatening language targeted towards racial or ethnic groups and possibly religious groups has the possibility to turn people off of the party brand. This happened in California in the 90s with really conservative anti-Latino, anti-immigrant policies that were coming out. And it not only turned a lot of Latino voters who had been trending Republican away from the Republican Party, and people have argued delivered them to the Democrats in that state, but it also moved a lot of sort of more racially liberal Republicans away from the party. So you saw across the board these groups moving away from Republicans. I think this is what you see the Republican elites really being afraid of right now. They are terrified that this primary season has damaged their brand irreparably with minority communities who are making up an increasing portion of the electorate. After the 2012 election, the Republican elite commissioned a report specifically asking how they could win and what went wrong in the 2012 presidential election. And the major conclusion was that the Republican Party has to appeal to Latinos. Latinos are an increasingly important part of the electorate. Romney got about 23% of the Latino vote. Estimates suggest that the Republican nominee, if they want to win this cycle, they need 47% of Latinos to support them.
Our show's sound engineer, Kevin Lowe, chose the next segment with Dr. Joshua Landis, a show about Syria, the Middle East, and the fight against ISIS. Enjoy this segment.
This is at the center of debate today. Who is responsible for ISIS? And once you can answer that question, you can try to figure out how to destroy it. And there is zero agreement on this because the Sunni opposition in Syria says Assad is responsible. Because you have bad government and you have an evil Shiite dominating the Sunnis, you have to destroy that evil Shiite government. Then Sunnis will go back to being the moderate, nice guys that they are. The Assad state and Russia today are saying, no, that is completely false. What's happened is that you've got failed states, and in those failed states, extremists can expand. And they say, look at Afghanistan, look at Iraq, look at Libya, look at Yemen. America thinks they're going to go in, do regime change, bring democracy, and what do? You get a failed state, and into that failed state, every extremist group under the sun who thinks they're going to build a caliphate or something weird is going to expand because there's nobody to destroy them.
You know, according to what you're saying, if we could somehow magically go back in time and just take ISIS and pull them out, you know, they're not there at all, they're not a factor, with everything you're saying, somebody else would still be in that space. Somebody else is going to come in and sort of take over where there's chaos.
That's true. And what's been unleashed in Iraq and Syria is an ethnic, religious struggle. Because the state has failed, everybody is trying to rebalance the ethnic balance. The Sunnis want to get rid of the Shiites from on top of them and minoritarian rule. In Iraq, it was the same thing. The Shiites want power, which they had never had for 1,400 years, and the Sunnis get driven out, and they're fighting for a hunk of the state back. So these failed states have unleashed this ethno-sectarian war, and it's very hard to put that back into the box.
Well, the other piece of this I want to bring in is the U.S., and particularly President Obama's decisions to be kind of a little bit involved in Syria, but not very much, and that kind of back and forth that he's gotten into. And there's a lot of finger pointing these days that said, look, if Barack Obama had handled this differently and had focused on what was happening with ISIS, we just wouldn't have this mess. What do you say about that?
I have some sympathy for President Obama not wanting to get involved in Syria and trying to get us out of Iraq and Afghanistan, because we've gotten ourselves into these ethnic battles, which we are not good at adjudicating and building a new state where you're going to have power sharing and so forth. We've tried that in Iraq for the last, 12 years, and we're clearly unsuccessful because ISIS has taken over the Sunnis again. Terrible struggle. We don't want to side with the Shiites too much against. So, in a sense, America is damned if they do, and they're damned if they don't. If they step in and try to nation build and adjudicate these problems, they get sucked into this very long nation building process, which is very expensive. If they don't do anything and take on these, then you get a failed state where the extremists run rampant. And we tried to stay out of Syria, but of course we get Paris. And there's the threat of further bombings in the West.
I think what you're saying is if we could go back to the moments of decision in the 2000s, around 2008, 2011 with the Arab Spring, et cetera, there just weren't a lot of good choices for the U.S. Is that right? I mean, we weren't going to jump in and do Afghanistan and Iraq all over again. That just, there wasn't any sympathy for that in the U.S.
I think there's a bad choice. If we go back to Afghanistan, after 78, 79, the Iranian Revolution, Russia thought, okay, I'm going to step into Afghanistan. I can snatch it because America's main gendarme, our big police state in Iran, has collapsed. And how did we try to drive the Russians out of Afghanistan? By arming fundamentalists and these mujahideen, people carrying out jihad, and use Islam against Afghanistan. That started, in a sense, this long snowball, because what did we get out of doing that? We got bin Laden and 9/11. Then we tried to destroy bin Laden and Al-Qaeda by occupying Iraq. And what did we do? We destroy the state there, and it turns into Al-Qaeda heaven. We want regime change in Syria by kicking over these very tough but unpopular dictatorships. We've opened the door for the spread of Al-Qaeda.
Right.
And we're trying to jam it back into the box and rebuild these states, but we don't really know how. And so we've gotten ourselves in a situation where the more we kick over sandboxes, the more chaos.
Next is my favorite show of the season, an interview with Sister Rosemary, a Catholic nun whom Time magazine has called one of the most influential people in the world. Enjoy these few moments with Sister Rosemary.
In fact, I came in when it was not even over. I just noticed there was a very difficult situation, and I could see there were some girls who were around coming back, trying to escape. And in fact, when I went to Gulu, I had not known even that situation was existing in a most difficult way in that. So I looked at the situation and I kind of read the signs of time, and I thought that was the only moment we could just open our door, could let the school not just be treated as a school, but become more of a home to welcome these young women who had nowhere to go, because as they escaped to come back, their people, the society was afraid of them. And everybody knew that these were potential killers, these were murderers, and they were calling them by names, and their own relatives, even their own parents were afraid of them and said, we could not live with these people in one place because they were trained to kill. So I decided that St. Monica would become a place to welcome these girls and make them feel more at home. It was really out of compassion and
So
care.
you were focusing on a need, my guess is, that not a lot of other people looked at, because here were these girls that were forced into committing these crimes against humanity, killing their own families. So basically, they're pariahs. I mean, nobody wants to have anything to do with them, except that you noticed that they were stranded.
Yeah,
They
and-
needed someplace to go.
Sure, and it was so difficult to imagine people thinking to say that we can do this to help this group of people or these children. And definitely, I personally never thought whatever I was doing would be something big to help and bring awareness. I really started it like in a small way, just moved by this situation and seeing exactly that I would have been in the same situation because I come from northern Uganda. I am a woman and I was born in that situation. I know the culture and I knew these children were totally abandoned, were not accepted. I said, since I feel I've been quite lucky, I've never been abducted. I managed to grow in my own homes, and I managed also to be able to go to school. My parents looked after me, and I thought I would do something different to change this situation.
There must have been people who disagreed with you. There must have been people at the time who said, look, these young girls acted like adults. They committed atrocities. They chopped up family members, killed their own families, etc. And so you had to swim against the tide and basically decide to be their champion. I'm sure there were people who disagreed with you.
In fact, there were a lot of people who disagreed with me. And of course, one thing is that St. Monica is a Catholic school to start with. And to be able to welcome girls who are expecting, who are pregnant, girls who have a very difficult background, especially being murderers, and girls who had children, that was totally against any policy of the Catholic Church. And I thank God because I didn't ask anybody. I just went on and started it. Of course, I met a lot of criticisms, and I had the most difficult time of my life. And I had some priests who even confronted me. And one time I told one priest, I told him, I say, Father, you keep on praying and we meet in church. I will continue doing what I'm doing. Because I think it is very important to help these women, these young girls and their children, because they were wondering how I was inviting women to come to school with their children. And of course, I didn't have a place where to keep the children as well.
I can see that St. Monica's, well, what we call now St. Monica's Vocational School, it was really just a kind of safe haven for a while. Was there an experience, a single experience, that showed you the possibility of a vocational school, something that could serve the girls more directly?
You know, that was something which just came as a need, because you can say these girls were abducted from very early stage of education. They didn't go far with their studies. And of course, you wouldn't know what to teach them if you really thought you were bringing them to school.
Yeah.
And I totally felt helpless because I knew there was no way I could teach them anything. And even if I speak about vocational training, I started with helping them to learn how to make dresses, and I'm not a seamstress. I started teaching them how to cook. I've never gone to culinary school. I have started making them learn how to do other courses which can earn them a living. I did none of those. What I can say about myself is that I came from a background of vocational skills because I've always seen my parents. I saw my father. My father was the best carpenter in town. And I saw with this carpentry, he brought us up. We all went to school. And of course, I thought that was something which was quite practical. I don't know if my father went to school, but I never saw him going to school, but I saw him doing the best work. So I knew these are some of the things I would introduce to help these young people.
As I recall, you had sort of two areas of teaching. There was the practical life skills, and then there was the vocational learning how to do a job.
Yes.
How did you develop that curriculum?
It was all looking at the situation and finding out some of these young women who are not capable to cope with any life situation.
That's all we have time for today. Thank you for watching some of our favorite moments from Current Conversation. I'm so glad that you could join us. See you next time for more Current Conversation. Thank you for watching.